Okay, we're now going to move into the freshman speech competition. One of the subjects of the speeches this morning, the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, referring to his own time at Harrow, said there were three particular challenges that he faced as a schoolboy that were particularly difficult to overcome. The first was to climb a wall that was leaning towards him. Second was to dance with a girl who was leaning away from him. And the third was to give a speech in public, and the last of these was the toughest. Now, for the last 3 weeks, the entire 9th grade has done just that and should feel very proud of themselves. And in a moment, we're going to hear from the three gentlemen who scored the highest at the semi-finals last Friday. The freshman speech contest has been going on for many years now, and everyone in this theatre has either gone through it or will do so in the next 2 years. And while it may feel like an arbitrary hurdle to clear, the skill it is trying to develop, that of being able to get up in front of a crowd and speak clearly, logically, and persuasively, even for just a few minutes, is one that everyone will need to acquire at some point in their lives. You all know the challenges this can entail. For the upperclassmen, it might be something you need to do as part of a college application or a job interview. For junior schoolers, it might be the special pleasure of giving an MBA assembly announcement whilst being serenaded by the inevitable falsetto chorus. But one way or another, it will affect everyone. This year's students had a choice of 3 topics for their speeches: resourcefulness, inclusivity, or assessing what they felt the most significant issue from the past decade is for the world going forward. And our distinguished judges for today, who will be assessing these speeches, are Mr. Yorko, Mr. Sandifer, Mrs. Bassett, Mr. Tips, and Mr. Sawyer. So thank you to all of them for helping out this morning. Also, thanks to Mr. Quinn for having helped make the whole contest run smoothly. Our finalists this morning are Browning Trainer, Andrew Smith, and Chanin Climaco. All three of them have done exceptionally well to be speaking here this morning, so please listen to them attentively and show your appreciation for what they have to say. Between the speeches, there'll be a brief pause as we wait for the judges to tally up the scores before the next speech begins, so please be patient during that time. The first speaker is Browning Trainer, so please welcome him as he comes to give his speech.
I'm Browning Trainer, and I'll be speaking on resourcefulness. Between Hawaii and the coast of California, there sits an island with an area of 100 square miles. It's called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and it's made of plastic. There are several such islands across the oceans that are very detrimental to our climate and the health of our oceans. But Bojan Slot, a 25-year-old Dutch inventor, had an idea about aquatic plastic removal that just might change all that. When Slot was 16, he and his family went scuba diving in Greece. And when he dove down under the water, he was surprised to see more plastic and trash than he saw fish. When he returned back home from his vacation, he decided that he wanted to do a little bit more research into this idea, and he used the platform of his high school research project to devote more time into developing his research on this idea. And as he started his research, he realized that there was only one idea about aquatic plastic removal at the time. And this was to use large steamboats with nets attached to the back and drive around the ocean and use those nets to sweep up all the plastic. However, this idea had many flaws. It would cost billions of dollars, take millions of years to get all the plastic out of the ocean, potentially harm wildlife by trapping them in the nets, and emit a ton of carbon into the atmosphere. So, Slot was back to the drawing board, but he didn't give up. He continued his research and eventually found out about the concept of ocean gyres. An ocean gyre is a circulatory system of wind and water currents that creates a type of vortex effect in the water in the ocean. And when other currents run into those vortexes, they lose their velocity and drop their load, which is mainly plastic, and that is how those islands of plastic are created. And so Slot realized that he could use those currents to his advantage, and that's how he came up with this idea to remove the plastic from the ocean. He decided that he would use 24 stations anchored to the bottom of the ocean and attach miles of synthetic barrier to each side and have the ocean currents push that plastic into the synthetic barrier. The barrier would extend about 10 feet under the surface of the ocean and have curved edges so that wildlife could swim underneath or around. and would also have microscopic holes so that microplastics and other small pieces of plastic would be able to be collected by the barrier. He continued to develop his idea and eventually began to make prototypes, and because that took so much time, he was no longer able to continue his studies and he dropped out of school. He created a company for his idea called the Ocean Cleanup, which he's the CEO and founder of. And his first prototype was actually released into the ocean in 2018 off the coast of San Francisco. So, as a high school age student, Slot had come up with a solution for a problem that he saw, experienced, and wanted to fix. The world is saturated with problems. Every day there's a new issue or a new problem to combat, and the combination of these can be overwhelming. But instead of focusing on the stress that's created by thinking you have to solve all of these problems, what if we just found one that we wanted to focus on and tried to solve that? If everyone in the world found one problem they wanted to focus on and solve, there would be 7.8 billion less problems. If everyone in this room found one they wanted to focus on and solve, there'd be about 900 less problems. Now that may not be 7.8 billion, but it's certainly a goal worth working toward. Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Andrew Smith.
Hi, my name is Andrew Smith, and I will be speaking about resourcefulness. We shall not flag nor fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall never surrender. He drank too much. He smoked too many cigars. He was a painter and a poet. He wrote about history, and he could give one hell of a speech. But he was best known for making history. It was the spring of 1940, and Sir Winston Churchill found himself in the middle of World War II, and he was losing a battle that could mean losing the whole war. It was Churchill's resourcefulness that enabled Britain to survive the Battle of Dunkirk, and his resourcefulness is shown through his inspirational leadership, as the opening quote shows, and his artistry, which enabled him to imagine, design, and pull off one of the greatest military maneuvers of all time. The events that occurred from May 20th to June 4th, called the Battle of Dunkirk in history books, is called the Miracle of Dunkirk by the British people. The situation the British faced at Dunkirk looked like it could only end in disaster. You see, a well-known piece of strategy of Hitler was called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. One of these German maneuvers had trapped about 338,000 Allied troops on the beaches at Dunkirk. The waters on this part of the coast were very shallow. This forced the big ships of the British Navy to anchor far offshore. The slow ferrying of troops out to the British ships let the German Luftwaffe bombers hit the ships hard. The evacuation was failing. This is where Churchill's resourcefulness, his creativity, saved the day. The Royal Air Force was created to defend the British homeland. And most history books will say that the Battle of Britain began on July 10th, 1940. But I believe it began a few weeks earlier, when Churchill ordered the RAF into the fray over the beaches at Dunkirk. As the air battle raged on for days, no troops on the ground could see what was happening, as thick black smoke covered the entire evacuation area from burning oil. But when it was said and done, the British had only lost 121 brave pilots for what many considered was a lost cause. But they managed to shoot down 326 German aircraft. The RAF brave pilots were able to buy enough time for Churchill's main creative miracle, the miracle of the little ships. Because of the shallow waters and the German bombing, Churchill needed a whole new fleet. But where do you get a whole new fleet designed for shallow waters in only a few days? Well, Churchill reached out to small civilian vessels and their captains, and this was mostly comprised of young men who were unable to fight. It was the most unlikely flotilla in British naval history. A hodgepodge collection of about 700 ships crossed the Channel in order to save the British troops. Think about this. The smallest of the ships that crossed the channels was a 15-foot fishing boat. That's smaller than most bass boats here on Tennessee lakes. Incredibly, the little ship succeeded. When it was originally thought that they would only save about 30,000 ships, they were able to save over 300,000 troops. The last soldier to leave Dunkirk was no low-ranking private. Instead, it was Major General Harold Alexander, who boarded the last of these small vessels and made a final tour of the harbor. Satisfied, he radioed British expeditionary forces evacuated. Clearly, Churchill's resourcefulness is shown through his creativity in using the RAF and the little ships, and using his inspirational words to unite the nation. But we shouldn't be surprised. You see, he was a historian, a painter, and a poet. And like him, the men on the Hill will fight for what we believe in with growing confidence. We will never give up, and like him, we may even smoke a few cigars, at least at graduation. But this I do know. We shall be resourceful, and we will make history. Thank you.
All right, and finally, our final speaker is Chanin Climaco.
Good morning, I'm Chanin Climaco, and I'll be speaking on climate change in the 2010s. It's May 1st, 2010, the beginning of the decade here in Nashville. News services are predicting rain showers, thunder, lightning, and maybe some flash floods. But in the next 36 hours, we would get much more than that. Nashville would receive 13.5 inches of rain. That leaves 31 people dead, $2.3 billion in damages, and 10,000 displaced from their homes. But the Nashville floods were not an isolated incident. 2 years later, Hurricane Sandy storms into the Northeast. And in 2017, Hurricane Harvey hits the Gulf of Mexico. Now, bushfires are raging through the continent of Australia. Just before the Nashville floods, though, Apple drops the iPad, a revolutionary technology which combined the portability of a handheld device with the capabilities of a personal computer. And around the same time Hurricane Sandy hits, NASA lands their 4th rover on Mars. The 2010s have marked a boom in technological advancements. But they've also signaled the increasing frequency of hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, bushfires, the effects of climate change. And now, the only way to avoid certain extinction is to focus our technology on the right target. Global warming was first observed around 200 years ago, during the Industrial Revolution, when factories began to spew millions of tons of carbon into the atmosphere. Studies have shown that since then, total carbon in our atmosphere has risen by 30%. Studies have also shown that, no, global warming isn't a result of the Earth's natural cycles, they're not a result of volcanic events, and they're certainly not a result of the sun spewing rays of heat at us. The globe is heating up, and it's because of us. In the 1970s, the US Department of Energy initiated a project that many at the time thought was insane. They tried to turn the sun's rays into energy. Today, we know that solar-powered energy is not only available at the governmental level, but is also available commercially, worldwide, even in your homes. Since 2010, solar production has risen by 2,000%, and wind-generated power is also soaring. It's doubled in the past decade, and is expected to double again in the next. Now, look, alternative energies are awesome. They're a concrete step away from the fossil fuels that are destroying our environment. But switching over isn't enough. Since the beginning of the decade, we've put out 407 million tons of carbon into the atmosphere. That's a really hard number to quantify, so imagine it like this. Every day, we emit enough carbon that we can wrap the entire globe in a layer about the thickness of a piece of paper. In a year, that's a layer of an inch. So, yes, alternative energies are great, but we need something to take carbon out of the atmosphere. That's where carbon capture and storage comes in. CCS is a technology that can reduce the globe's carbon emissions by 90%, sucking them out before they can even come back in. It's one of the only technologies that we have that can act in what's known as a carbon negative mode, literally sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. That's crucial to keeping under a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius, a threshold that the IPCC has marked as necessary to saving our environment. Climate change will continue to pose further risks and challenges to our environment, some of which may be close to impossible to overcome. But by using technology as a means to combat the threat, we can mitigate the risks of sea levels rising, ice caps melting, species loss, the deaths of entire coral reefs, and the sixth mass extinction. The 2010s have scorched the globe. So let's use the 2020s to cool it down. Thank you.
We have tallied up the scores for this year's competition. Very close outcome. Thank you again to the judges and the speakers. All three finalists will receive a $100 gift card. The winner will receive a $250 gift card. And this year's winner is Chanin Climaco.